Welcome to Things You Don't Know. In this episode, we will be looking at some very interesting topics concerning the war in Vietnam. With the exception of the Civil War, no agony of peace or war disturbed the domestic tranquility of the United States as much as the 20-year-long Vietnam War. It seemed the struggle had gone on forever by the time a peace treaty was signed in Paris in January of 1973. 58,000 Americans and 15,000 other allies had died, along with 2 million Vietnamese. Two presidencies had been completely destroyed, and 58,000 young men had chosen exile in Canada and Sweden. This podcast is an intellectual appetizer for a book that Dr. Deneen is in the works of publishing.
It's always interested me as the son of a Vietnam veteran. Why did so many previous attempts at peace fail? The length of what's been called America's Trojan War was not inevitable. There were five major and at least as many minor attempts at settling America's most divisive 20th century conflict. They all failed because of mistakes in timing and confusion. The United States would agree to one proposal, and the North Vietnamese wouldn't. The North Vietnamese would make an attempt to have a treaty signed, and the U.S. would reject it, or a third party, with the best of intentions trying to mediate, would insert some new condition or make a mistake neither side agreed with.
Well, let's look at these proposals in order. The first major effort to end the Vietnamese tragedy took place in early April of 1965. President Johnson gave a major foreign policy speech at Johns Hopkins University near Baltimore, offering over $1 billion in aid to North Vietnam if it would withdraw its troops from the South. Since the conflict had yet to become a national crisis, this appeal went nowhere. There are several foundational factors concerning the Vietnam War that are either glossed over or ignored entirely. The first issue I'm referring to is how we got involved in the first place. Remember that President Eisenhower decided that the USA should take over advising, quote, read that in quotes, after the French left in 1954. The second, and by the way, that led to a whole raft of decisions that fell into line along with that, almost all of which I think were specious. The second thing that happened is that I have read that Ho Chi Minh studied at the University of Chicago. Now, that seems to have been covered up somehow because I haven't read it recently, but I do remember it. So take that with a grain of salt, if you will. We do know that he spent significant time in the USA and France. Uh, Most notably, there's a famous picture of him working as a pastry chef. So anyhow, the last point is interesting and seems to have been expunged from the mainstream historical record. I truly suspect that this was engineered to protect Ho's socialistic communistic ideology. We do know, as I said, that he spent time in the USA and France. The reason this is important is that Ho had personally seen and been involved in Western freedoms and governing practices. When he asked for help from the USA, okay, let me say that again. When he asked for help from the USA, the overarching concern and also the ideology that went behind that We are the United States. No one can do our deal unless they bow to our culture, our theories, our notions. And besides the which, the notion was the domino effect, the creeping crud of communism. If we let it go at all, it will slowly, like an amoeba, move into all the countries of the world. To me, that says that we didn't believe in our system very much. And perhaps we should have had some thought about that. That, if our system was actually all that great and wonderful, that it would will out in the end, unless, of course, all the world is crazy. Reminds me of the story about the old Amish couple riding in their wagon. And the man turns to his wife and says, all the world is crazy, but me and thee, Sari, and sometimes I think thou art a little strange. When somebody thinks that, and they think that way, they need to evaluate that if everyone else is crazy except me, maybe, just maybe, I'm the one who is screwed up. It's an interesting concept. Think about it.
I think as a historian, your basic argument is sound. Ho did seek the help of Woodrow Wilson at the end of the First World War and President Truman at the end of the Second. But it is important to remember, as with many other leaders in the developing world, that once the West rejected Ho, he fully embraced the Soviet Union and the Marxist ideal. There were purges, some attempts at land expropriation, so-called land reform, and other types of subjugation. The South Vietnamese government vacillated for a 20-year period between military juntas and semi-democracy under the rule of Cao Ki and President Tu. But even during its most restrictive periods, and let me say this, ordinary citizens could work, worship, and largely live as they pleased. This is an authoritarian regime, not a totalitarian. What's the difference? An authoritarian regime is interested in political control. There are private sectors in the outside the government influences but does not control. Totalitarians, whether on the left or the right, control everything. We must also remember the escalation of the war beginning in 1965 was taking place during the 3 years of chaos in South Vietnam between the fall of the Dem government just prior to President Kennedy's assassination in 1963 and the rise of Marshal Cao Ki 3 years later. By this time, Ho Chi Minh had begun to slowly age, and while retaining veto power, had turned the reins of the government over to a troika. Foreign Minister Lee Wan, a hardliner, guerrilla warfare genius and former history professor General Vo Giap, and the chair of the State Council, Nguyen Hire. This complexity in the North Vietnamese government set the stage for significant difficulties because of strategy and political disagreements within this troika. As I said, in addition, the government in South Vietnam seemed to be in constant upheaval. There were 6 coups in 18 months, as well as endemic economic corruption, internecine ethnic conflicts, and religious conflicts between the Buddhist, Catholic, and Cao Dai faiths. Therefore, there was no consistent voice speaking for either government, making negotiations almost impossible. The next major initiative was codenamed Marigold. This second major attempt took place in late 1966. Of all the efforts we are going to cover, this effort probably came closest to achieving peace. The story of its failure would take up a great portion of the booklet I'm going to write. But for now, I can give our listeners the Reader's Digest version.
Oh, yeah, glad to hear that. Otherwise, we might be here all day.
You know me too well, Doctor. Because of its strong connection with the Catholic Church and ability to make consumer goods the Soviets needed, Poland, of all the Eastern European satellites, had a little more freedom than the other nations behind the Iron Curtain. Poles were allowed to maintain an ambassador, for example, to non-communist South Vietnam, in the hopes that their intercession might promote peace. Janusz Lewinsky, a 33-year-old protege of reformer Polish General Secretary Władysław Gomułka, took up his place on what was called the International Control Commission, along with Indian and Canadian delegates, to engage in the Herculean task of trying to find a compromise. Lewinsky often made the rounds of the local hotspots in the company of his female secretary, who was really a colonel in the secret police. It's one of the ironies of history that Poland and Italy on the western side were two nations that were trusted by both sides, but were not involved militarily in Vietnam. And it was themselves, rather than the United Nations or the main parties involved, at least in the beginning, that moved heaven and earth to try to settle this Vietnamese conflict. Now, the Italian envoy, Giovanni d'Orlandi, is a fascinating character. He's known in the diplomatic world as the little engine that could. He was one of the few European chargé d'affaires who had yet to become a professional diplomat or a professional politician. He had friends all over the political spectrum, from Democratic Socialist leader Aldo Moro to Umberto II, the exiled king of Italy. He was a passionate supporter of American culture, to the point of having Washington Redskins football scores put in the diplomatic bag. This is where this story really gets interesting. By this time, there were 150,000 American troops in South Vietnam, and 15,000 had been killed. President Johnson had an almost impossible task. He wished to avoid criticism from the peace movement for expanding and even continuing the war at all, and for more conservative critics for his less than effective prosecution of what they saw as a struggle against Marxism. The fear of communist Chinese troops being sent into combat, as they had been 15 years earlier in Korea, had kept the president from accepting military support from Chiang Kai-shek in Taiwan. Listen to our Ice Cream as Propaganda podcast if you want more information on Taiwan. Two other controversial nations, Rhodesia and Francoist Spain, had offered support to the war effort also. However, fear of appearing to be racist was the main factor causing the rejection by the United States of troops from white-dominated Rhodesia, although ironically, these were African Matabele troops from the Rhodesian African Rifles. And fear of appearing to ally with a dictatorship is the reason why troops from semi-fascist colonial Spain, still ruled by General Francisco Franco, were also turned down. So clearly something had to be done to break the impasse and bring peace. That good old boy from Rome, as Senator John Stennis called him, just might have been able to win the day. The United States agreed to withdraw under the so-called Phase A formula, in which all troops would be gone 6 months after the commitment of North Vietnam to withdraw its invasion troops from the South and agree to more negotiations. In the Western point of view, both societies would have been allowed, similar to East and West Germany, to develop separately in peace. The North Vietnamese saw this phased withdrawal as a camouflaged Western surrender. Whether this was a fig leaf over a surrender or a peace compromise is brilliantly analyzed in the writings of George Washington University professor Dr. James Hirschberg in his 1,000-page book, also called Marigold, which is a fascinating read, my friends. It reads like a political science textbook turned into a thriller novel. Dr. Hirschberg pays tribute to the help of Canadian leaders, including Minister of External Affairs Paul Martin Sr., in his gallant efforts to rectify the U.S. and communist points of view. Martin was reluctant to be what he called an errand boy for U.S. Secretary of State Dean Rusk, but he had a strong commitment to peace, and Canada was getting a little concerned about many of the young men who had gone up north to avoid the draft. The Martin Plan advocated a force made up from neutral countries, initially Ireland, Portugal, and Burma, to safeguard South Vietnamese independence in exchange for a large economic aid package for Laos and communist North Vietnam, guaranteed by the World Bank and in excess of $10 billion. We forget the large role our British allies played also in fighting for peace. The second in command of Prime Minister Harold Wilson, Foreign Secretary George Brown, had worked for a year trying to split the armies and the political leaders of the Viet Cong from the North Vietnamese, as well as offering United Nations peacekeeping forces to enforce a future peace just as they did in Egypt. Brown was a brilliant, kind man, but he had one very human weakness: liquor. He was a hopeless alcoholic. Andrew Roberts' brilliant work, pick this up if you haven't, my friends. The History of the English-Speaking Peoples details Brown's mistakes. Quote, when soused, George would revert to almost manic foolishness, said the Labour Party spokesman and future Prime Minister James Callaghan. Mr. Brown would act like an excited adolescent. He still remembered in Peru for grabbing the chest of the Archbishop of Lima, mistaking him in his intoxicated state for a chorus girl. But now his inability to control his drinking would move beyond a private vice to have a disastrous effect on the struggle for Vietnamese peace. After 6 months of hard bargaining, President Johnson had agreed to negotiations. The North Vietnamese had agreed to an initial meeting, had dropped their demand for a separate Viet Cong delegation, and had also inserted a strong statement against the Khmer Rouge rebels in Cambodia. See our Deals with the Devil podcast for more about them. Had this worked, the war could have ended 6 years before it did. Alas, Secretary Brown failed in his messenger duties, and the information was never relayed to President Johnson. Nursing a severe hangover after a bender, he slept in and delayed sending a confirming telegram to both the president and the special envoy for Vietnam, the 1960 Republican candidate for vice president, Henry Cabot Lodge. Lodge logically but incorrectly assumed all entreaties had been rejected, reported failure to Washington, which caused the president to step up the attacks, and therefore General Westmoreland began the first bombing runs over Hanoi and more bombing runs over the city of Haiphong in December of 1966. This led to the collapse of the second major attempt at peace. Operation Pennsylvania took place in late 1967 after the South Vietnamese elections. There were 300,000 troops present by that time and 24,000 dead. Future National Security Advisor and Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, then a well-regarded political science professor at Harvard, was dispatched to Hanoi with Dr. Ramon Aubec and Mr. Herbert Moscovich, who were a French neurologist and a prominent businessman who were personal friends of Ho Chi Minh. At this time, there were internecine conflicts in the communist world, so even the Soviet Union desired an end to the fighting so it could outflank China in a propaganda war. The Soviets and Mao Zedong's Chinese had their own conflict going on over which society was closer to communist purity. There's a wonderful film about that called Dark Night Over China, if you ever want to see it. But the Pennsylvania gambit fails because the Vietnamese are still convinced they can have a battlefield victory, and the South Koreans, under the brilliant but unstable president Park Chung-hee, have convinced President Johnson to ratchet up forces yet again by another 100,000 men. If you want to know about Park's demise, watch the comedy film The President's Last Bang. He dies in a house of ill repute, shot by his brother-in-law. While all of this posturing was going on, the United States made a serious error, ignoring the tension between Prince Sihanouk and his cousin Ronald in Cambodia, which led to the rise of the Khmer Rouge. Dr. Lloyd Gardner's wonderful book, The Search for Peace in Vietnam, 1964 to 1969, details the mistake of ignoring Cambodia while engaging in strong negotiations over the fate of Vietnam. In January 1970, President Tu announced the NLF, the National Liberation Front, the fancy word for the Viet Cong, would be considered just another political party with full rights to run for office if they laid down their arms. Tu sought stability, desiring all armies within the former Indochina to remain in place. After President Johnson had given up a second term in March of 1968, he called for a renewal of the Geneva Conference, which had partitioned Vietnam 14 years earlier, of which the United Kingdom and the Soviet Union were co-chairs. This did not happen. Newly elected President Richard Nixon started withdrawing troops as part of his Vietnamization campaign, while stepping up bombing Cambodia, military raids on Laos, and the so-called Phoenix program to turn or capture a number of communist officials. The stage was now set for the final act. Now, the quest for a compromise would shift to Asia. Two brilliant and surprisingly progressive monarchs, His Imperial Majesty Mohammed Reza Pahlavi, the last Shah of Iran, and King Nasser Shah of Afghanistan, would try to help the West out of its biggest conundrum and save their own thrones at the same time, to no avail. Iran sought, through a combination of vast amounts of oil wealth, political repression through the Savak secret police, and so-called managed reforms, giving women the right to vote and for free loans, interest-free loans to poor people, the so-called white revolution, to bring that nation in line with the developed world. In 1971, the Shah decided to hold a worldwide summit under the guise of a party celebrating the 25th anniversary, the 2500th anniversary of the founding monarch of the Persian Empire, King Cyrus the Great, who was the only ruler with the honor of being mentioned in three sacred scriptural writings: the Judeo-Christian Bible, the Muslim Quran, and the Zen Avesta of the Zoroastrians. His Imperial Majesty felt that the Vietnamese dispute required his personal intervention. So he invited heads of state and other political figures from throughout the world to his fantasy city in the desert in a place called Persepolis. This party cost $500 million. No wonder the revolt against his excesses and the desire for a pure Islamic society happened just a few years later. Soviet Premier Alexei Kosygin and American Vice President Spiro Agnew attended this week-long celebration, along with Yugoslavian leader Joseph Tito and the exiled king of Greece, Constantine II, as mediators. By this time, American troops had been reduced from their height of 540,000 in 1968 to barely 35,000 3 years later. A great deal of air support was still going on. Propaganda programs, Phoenix and Shaohoi, and the so-called Vietnamization movement were in full swing. Arguments over the level of future aid to the North and the composition of the South Vietnamese government of national unity ended that parley without any success. The Afghan monarch's intervention came about slightly earlier, toward the end of 1970. My old mentor, Dr. Darwood Farahi, the former president of Kane University, was the son of an Afghan cabinet minister. His father told him the king had convinced the North Vietnamese to make an agreement and the United States when the Cambodian invasion happened and another conflict broke out over the new government in Laos. So none of these things, despite a tremendous amount of energy and willpower, accomplished the end of the war.
So, why did it take so much time for the longest war prior to Afghanistan, of course, to end? The United States had to agree to substantial amounts of economic aid for both sides. The South Koreans had to agree to withdraw their forces, both conventional and guerrilla. The North had to drop its demand for the overthrow of Nguyen II government. They would do so themselves in April of 1975. So the war finally ended in January of 1973 after 4 agonizing years of negotiations in Paris. The defeat of the Easter Offensive convinced the North Vietnamese that they would have to win at the negotiation table what they couldn't seize on the battlefield. Okay, well, this is a brief review of some of the issues involved in this tragic and somewhat ridiculous episode in our history. I would encourage you to pick up Dr. Dean's book, which will be published soon. And we thank you for joining us today.
Yes, my friends, thank you very much. And there are many more details about what I talked about here and also some other things that I haven't yet mentioned. So when it does come out, I hope you will take the time to read it.
Okay, bye for now.
So long.